To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep, no more. Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1. Hamlet's famous soliloquy on death is one that sometimes plays into how I view the world. Whether ultimately any of this is truly worth the troubles we go for, and yet the overriding fear of the ultimate undiscovered country is the defining element of our lives and how we live them. In our modern world, it still holds enormous power by simply putting this before us, the question to which nobody has an answer. It's probably the most famous set of text in fiction, so much has been said, and I think my Doctor Who review is unlikely to add anything of substance to it, so I'll just skip to the bit where it's relevant. You may think I'm about to do a "but I wish I was dead because of this episode," or "watching bad Doctor Who is similar to it" bit, but I'm not. The relevance is more to do with this episode's attitude to life and death, to its presentation of similar thoughts those espoused in Hamlet's famous words. He spoke words that have become so famous by considering the smallest possible stakes one can consider when talking about life and death, his own life. This episode, when considering life and death on the largest possible scale, that of an entire world and its civilization, and yet still considering that least consequential form, that of one life, it's crushed by its own questions. Now, you may ask why I'm comparing one of the most important works in the history of literature with a science fiction show where the main character travels around in the police box, and the answer is I'm not really. I'm not expecting Doctor Who to live up to that impossible standard, for obvious reasons. I'm using that standard as a point of reference to show the importance of these themes and how they are implemented, not to show that it's a standard they should have met, because that would be ridiculous. This will, however, become apparent in time. Let's cut to the chase, shall we? For this, the 1st of April, my most hated of days, which has become the international date of the idea of low-intelligence fooling as some kind of twisted art form, the Doctor Who Review Guide will look at my pick for the worst episode of NuWho. There are truly many contenders for this prize. We've had a man having sex with a paving slab, wacky slapstick with Hitler, and a Dalek being defeated by a microwave, and everything in between. Indeed, Series 8 itself provides more contenders than just this episode. Who can forget petty racism towards a war criminal, or the planet Earth being saved by fireproof trees? But in the inane and the stupid, the baffling and the frankly offensive, there is Kill the Moon. This episode takes this coveted spot simply because of how all the layers of awful build up on top of themselves over and over again until one final shit cherry in this manure cake. One of the stupidest plots I've ever seen, a million logic holes that show just how badly thought out it was, atrocious dialogue, awful characterisation, a horrifically botched moral dilemma, and one of the most egregious portrayals of a long-established character I've ever seen, all in the service of a really, really stupid and ill-thought-out political message. It's the kind of thing that makes one wonder how on earth anyone at any point thought any of this was remotely a good idea. Frankly, I'd go as far as to say this is the worst piece of televised Doctor Who ever made, and I'm only refraining from calling it the worst piece of performed Who media because Big Finish once made a story where a companion gets raped. Now, admittedly, as awful as Kill the Moon is, it is a long, long, long way off that kind of depravity, so congratulations, you made an episode better than the one where Peter Davison demanded the writer be fired because of how horrific it was, an achievement to be proud of. Now, this episode is pretty notorious, and even the most ardent Moffat-era defenders frequently tend to abandon this one to the wolves. However, if there's one thing that can be learned from all these years of following this show, every single episode of Doctor Who, bar none, has someone willing to defend it, and this episode is not going to be any different. So, if you like this episode, don't let me dissuade you from that. You like what you want to like, and I'll admit, my views may be somewhat clouded by how much I dislike the central character dynamic of this series, and to be frank, the character of Clara. And if you really like both, well, you may have more patience for the character dynamics of this than I do. But I'd also advise you, if you do like this episode, just turn off now. You're not going to like anything I have to say, and I'm not going to pull any punches in how I do it. Now, of course, I would like to engage in fair and vigorous debate with those who hold all kinds of views about Doctor Who, and I still invite that, but this is a no-holds-barred approach. It probably requires some warning. Anyway, let's get on with it, I suppose. Let's start this by talking about politics. Now, we live in very unpolitical times. Oh wait, no, hang on, not that. We in fact live in very political times, and it's therefore inevitable discussion of it eventually becomes very charged, and the politics of Doctor Who are no different in that respect. While we live in very political times, most of Doctor Who's time on the air has been in similarly charged times. Arguably the only period we've had since 1963 you could call not very political was the time between the end of the Cold War and 9/11. i.e. the 90s, i.e. the time when Doctor Who was off the air, so it's therefore unsurprising Doctor Who has had a long and complex relationship with the politics of its day. In the 60s, Doctor Who rarely approached contemporary political issues, true, but nevertheless used political ideas all the time. The series' most famous monsters came about as a metaphor for the Nazis and an exploration of the ideas of the nuclear age, after all. The 70s is when political Doctor Who really came of age, with an influx of writers who seemed determined to tackle the ideas of the day. Most notably was Malcolm Hulke, who wrote my pick for Doctor Who's greatest political tale, Doctor Who and the Silurians, which was a frank examination of Britain's political establishment and its place in the Cold War. Now, this has ebbed and flowed over time, as the Pertwee era was the high point of this approach, which is reducing considerably when Philip Hinchliffe decides to focus on the sci-fi aspects of the series above all else, but it never disappeared completely. Similarly, it had peaks and troughs in the 80s, the peak probably being the McCoy era, when many writers used the show to express their frustrations at the Thatcher era. The reasons for all this are numerous. Science fiction tends to lend itself to ideas about progress and moving forward, for instance, and is also an obvious means of exploring the ideas of the day in a setting where the link can be used as allegory. Take, for instance, the two Peladon stories, where the titular planet was mysteriously having exactly the same political problems as Britain in the early 1970s. This does, however, lead into another pretty inescapable fact about Doctor Who's politics: it's almost always pretty left-wing. In the 60s, there were a few times when the show, and indeed TV's relationship with politics, was still developing that meant this wasn't quite the case, although in all cases it's debatable, but once the 70s started, Who has been flying the red flag ever since. Remember Malcolm Hulke, who I praised his skills for writing political tales? Yeah, he was an actual honest-to-God no-compromises communist, and in fact before his time on Who had been a card-carrying member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. It's therefore not terribly surprising that his stories tended to be on the left side of the spectrum in that case, and most other political writers of the classic show felt the same way. Now, while I'm very, very far from a conservative, big or small c, I'm not a socialist either, but for me that's never been a problem when it comes to political Who, because I don't mind the very left-wing messages, as long as they're used to tell a good story, are presented with subtlety and tact, and are integrated into the story to present their allegory in a clever way. Doctor Who and the Silurians is a perfect example of this. The story Hulke tells is a very strong one, the political ideas are allowed to be at exactly the level they need to be, and they're woven into the tapestry of the story. Despite his politics being on the extreme ends of things, Hulke was very good at this subtlety that made his stories feel like they handled their politics very well, and this was an art that was lost going into the 1980s and has yet to be rediscovered. Much of the anti-Thatcherist politics of the McCoy era is just cringeworthy in how on the nose it is. Like, yeah, I don't like Thatcher either, but you're not being clever with your analogue of her is forcing everyone to be happy all the time, you're just venting. Which is fine, I can't begrudge someone being frustrated at the developments of those years, it just doesn't make very good television when all you're doing is ranting onto the paper. As for NuWho, well, NuWho and subtlety had never gone hand in hand, had they? So its attempts at politics had never gone brilliantly, such as fart jokes in the analogy for the Iraq War, for instance, or capitalism is going to charge you for breathing, for instance. I don't mind if you want to make an episode about capitalism being bad, I do mind if you don't put any thought into the analogy and give it layers of subtlety. I'm pretty sure Malcolm Hulke was not an enormous fan of the British political establishment he was lampooning in Doctor Who and the Silurians, and yet it never felt like a rant on his part. The reason for this left-wing bent in Doctor Who, it's mostly to do with the kind of people who go into writing, especially in a sci-fi show. The arts are always going to be more left-wing than general society, and they're going to be attracted to science fiction shows, which are again, they're about progress, exploring what's possible, all that stuff. I don't think it's that much more complex than that, personally. The point I'm reaching for here is that Doctor Who and left-wing politics have a long and complex history, and it frankly makes me laugh when idiots aside with Doctor Who only mysteriously became political and left-wing when they casted a woman as a Doctor. What Doctor Who doesn't have a long and complex history with is right-wing politics. Sure, as I said earlier, you had one or two stories in the 60s where you could maybe get a right-wing message from it if you squinted sideways, but I never really saw it when it's been alleged. Then you had the Sunmakers during the mid-70s, which Robert Holmes apparently wrote as an attack on the tax regime of the dying Labour government at the time. Now, obviously, if you've seen the Sunmakers, you know it feels like more of an attack on corporations and the drive for profit running against human well-being, which doesn't sound very right-wing to me. Now, I've seen it posited this was sort of an accident that Holmes fell into that, but come on, the man knew Doctor Who backwards and was no stranger to politics in the show either. It's less he accidentally wrote a very left-wing analogy while trying to write a very right-wing one, and more Holmes just had very weird and all over the place politics and that showed up in the writing. So I don't accept that as a story of right-wing politics. Another instance of it possibly being there was Nightmare of Eden a few years later, which is an anti-drugs episode, but you have to remember the time it was written. This was 1979, the war on drugs hadn't been used as a right-wing point yet by people like Reagan, so I'm not really sure if it counts. And the 80s, well, no chance. Doctor Who was not going to be that kind of vehicle at that point. Equally, NuWho was not really the kind of place where right-wing politics sort of flourished. Only when they stumbled into it accidentally in typically cat-candid NuWho fashion did it come about, such as when they accidentally endorsed slavery with the Ood and had to backtrack very abruptly by making them all space monks. Mostly NuWho's politics generally fell into three categories: hideously unsubtle left wing, very muddled and confused, for instance the analogy for refugees and civil conflict they do in the next series after this one, and this episode. Now, we've done a brief examination of politics in Doctor Who. Let's look at how this episode relates to politics. Because, well, Kill the Moon is a very right-wing episode, but it's only really because of how it handles one particular issue. This episode is an analogy for abortion. Now, those of you who haven't actually seen this episode before or heard of it may be surprised by that news, and you've just fallen into two categories. Those in the United States who have just gasped and fallen off your chair, and those not in the United States who are scratching their head wondering what the big issue is. In the US, abortion is one of the biggest political issues there is. Politics in many trade places is driven by this one issue alone. It's one of the biggest dividing lines in a very divided country, and it is fair to say there are some people who are Democrats or Republicans solely because of their position on that issue. But in the rest of the Anglosphere, and particularly the UK, it's not really an issue at all. It's considered a not terribly pleasant but necessary thing, and even those on the furthest right of the Conservative Party just sort of leave it alone. It's not a wedge issue in any way in this country, it's barely even discussed. So we have an episode with a very right-wing anti-abortion message in a country where there's not a remotely salient political issue. Now, I want to go on the record to say that approaching this issue at all in Doctor Who was just a bad idea to begin with. In the UK, i.e. the country the show is made, first broadcast and should be tailored to, nobody cares. And it's a shockingly supercharged issue in the US, where passions run very high, and all you're going to do is just make people angry when the episode does reach there. It's making an episode for a market other than the one it's actually made for, but making an episode with this message for that market is a horrifically bad idea. But if it really, really had to be done, there were ways to make it work, which brings me back to the subtlety point, because this episode has none. Now, it is very firmly taken a side in this debate, which is not necessarily a problem. After all, it's not as if all the left-wing stories waffling about whether capitalism is any good or not. They approach it with one very clear message, but the problem is the way this episode approaches it. Now let's just ignore the fact that the baby in this analogy is the fact the moon is an egg. That's obviously a level of utter stupidity that goes beyond simple politics, and we'll get to it, that's not what I mean. How the argument and the exploration is constructed is just the laziest and cheapest way of going about it. The characters who espouse the view chosen by the writers are 100% right about it, and the straw man character created to oppose them is completely unreasonable and 100% wrong. The way to reach the message you want to reach should be a journey of realisation, and the acceptance that for a complex issue like this, there are different points of view and arguments to be had, and there are no easy answers. Even if you believe strongly in one side of the issue, even if you think the other side is completely wrong, you cannot write a story with a message like that, because it will come off as loaded and preachy. And by God does this episode come off as loaded and preachy. Astronaut Lady is giving points here that are, to me, unpleasant but avoidable. But the script clearly designed them to be paranoid and self-destructive, and Clara sanctimoniously preaching the virtues of her argument in the way that would make me hate her even if I thought her argument was any good. Abortion is a very, very complex issue with so many sides to it, and it simply, in my view, cannot be boiled down to a good versus evil debate as they do here. Whatever your views on it, the portrayal here, the one side is completely on the right and the other a straw man, it's a terrible way to do it. It does depend on the issue as to how much this is the case. For instance, as much as I find the message in Oxygen heavy-handed, to the point where it basically ruins the episode for me, unfortunately, it would be madness for it to take a balanced approach. In your capitalism is bad story, expecting, well, actually maybe capitalism isn't bad, well, it's just plain silly, that's not going to work, is it? The views one tends to take on the fundamental economic systems of society, they're far more black and white with something than abortion. Abortion is something with no easy answers, whereas for someone who holds views on capitalism and its role, there are really easy answers. It's either good or bad. That's why this makes me angry with how it's handled. It's taken an issue for which there is so much nuance. As I said, there are no easy answers at all, and there should be genuine discussion, and it's turning it into a preaching session. What's laughable about all of this is that the writer has apparently denied this was the intention, which to me is just the most absurd thing I've ever heard. Of course you didn't intend an abortion metaphor when the characters are discussing the life of an unborn baby and whether it should be able to live despite the risk to others. Of course you didn't intend that. Oh, and when writing Aliens in London, Russell T Davies definitely didn't intend for that dead PM to be Tony Blair. Definitely not. What a pile of horseshit. I'm not giving that any more dignity by discussing it, frankly. If you seriously believe him when he says that, I have some oceanfront property in Nottingham to sell you. Oh, by the way, remember that awkward and confused look at refugees and civil conflicts I mentioned they made the next series? Guess who wrote that? Yeah, the numbnut who wrote this episode. What else can you say, really? As for the actual contents of that moral dilemma, we'll get to it a little later. Before we get on to the rest of the script, let's take a brief look at the production. I do feel for those on the production side of terrible episodes like this. It's not the director's fault he's been assigned the episode where the moon turns out to be an egg. It's not his fault the episode turned out shit as a result. The director of this was Paul Wilmshurst, who had a pretty short Who career. This episode, the next one, the much better Mummy on the Orient Express, and then the Christmas special later that year, Last Christmas. You remember Last Christmas, right? When we celebrated the happiest time of the year, the time of peace and joy among all men, when families come together to celebrate, with some psychological horror. But again, that wasn't his fault, he didn't write the script for that either, and Mummy is very well done, so I'll give him the benefit of the doubt there. The directing job here isn't awful, it's not great either though. It's serviceable, the editing is quite distractingly choppy at times, and you get the feeling that Wilmshurst's heart wasn't really in it, which, fair enough. He probably did read the script after all. There are one or two aspects of the production I do like. The sound design is quite good, being pretty much the only thing adding any atmosphere to the piece. And I'll admit, the editing later in the episode, when Clara is holding the world vote, does add to the weight of the situation, which is good because the script is definitely not. So it's nice to have something. Finally, it is worth mentioning that the episode was, believe it or not, filmed overseas, in Lanzarote, which doubled for the surface of the moon, and I've probably pronounced Lanzarote wrong, sorry, I'm not looking it up. Now if that sounds familiar to you in a Doctor Who context, that's because that's where Planet of Fire was filmed way back in the 80s, doubling for Planet Sun and also featuring as itself. Now, Planet of Fire is not an impressive story by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the positives was the impressive scenery and how director Fiona Cumming milked all she could out of it to make one of the best looking stories of the era, possibly even the whole classic run, at least in those location scenes. The script is rubbish, but at least that beautiful scenery adds some scope to it. Kill the Moon instead uses Lanzarote, as I said, to double in for the moon, which means that all the scenery is buried in the CGI to turn this into the moon, so basically all we actually see of Lanzarote is the ground, and frankly it's not worth it. I mean, it looks fine, don't get me wrong, but for the money they must have spent to get everyone out there to film this, I frankly don't see anything they couldn't have done in the BBC quarry for a fraction of the price. The money just ain't on the screen. And well, of course it's not. You're covering it all on CGI because it has to become the moon. What the hell was the point of that? So it doesn't succeed in my view. As for the script, look, this is a bad script, we all know that. Peter Harness, who I don't think I've actually mentioned by name yet, so yeah, the writer's a bloke called Peter Harness, apparently came up with this idea a few years earlier, which means that this is not a case where I can blame Stephen Moffat for coming up with a shit idea and palming it off onto another writer. This was Harness through and through. In fact, all I can find about Moffat's influence on this was that he told Harness to inject some more horror into the early parts of the episode. And while it doesn't really work for me, it's not what drags the story down. It's dull, it's not insulting. So this isn't going to be a bash Moffat exercise. Let's face it, I'm going to have plenty of opportunities for that. I'm not going to do it when it's not deserved. There are plenty of things I'm not going to focus on for reasons of brevity. The dialogue, for instance, is atrocious. So stilted and awkward, bereft of any depth or wit. I mean, it's bad, what is there to say about it? So many stupid and awkward moments throughout the episode, like when the TARDIS crew first meets the astronauts. Yeah, it's stupid they so quickly accept these stowaways based on some ridiculous stuff some old Scottish man is saying. It's just cringeworthy. But then it's partially because they only have 45 minutes to play with. In the end, that kind of thing is priced in for NuWho. The Doctor tells Clara, an astronaut lady, to go on ahead without him, only for him to catch up with him so quickly it means he must have spent at most 30 seconds or so down in the crater, and yet somehow managed to get a full scan of the creature inside the moon using the contents of his arse. Whatever. There are giant spiders on the moon which turn out to be this creature's versions of microorganisms. Yes, because there's a huge difference in size between the microorganisms on an elephant and on a flea. Oh, no, there isn't actually. They're exactly the same because that's not how that works! Oh, and apparently disinfectant just kills them by spraying it on them. Again, not really how that works. Oh, and a really egregious rear in the future remark that makes absolutely no sense.
What are you doing?
Putting some pictures on Tumblr.
No, Courtney, don't put any photos on Tumblr.
My granny used to put things on Tumblr.
What? This has been established to be 2049. That's only 35 years after the broadcast of this episode, and only 25 years from now. Oh Christ, has it really been 10 years? Anyway, going by the age of the actress, the character here is 47 years old, meaning she was born in 2002. This isn't some space-age future where the present is outside of living memory. It's just a few decades down the line. In fact, it's entirely plausible Clara could be teaching the younger version of this character. So no, your granny was not using Tumblr. You probably were. Your granny was reading the Daily Mail and voting for Brexit. I know it's a minor thing, but it just shows how ill thought out the episode was, putting in stupid quotes for flimsy reasons without any thought about whether they fit or not. But as I said, for reasons of brevity, I'm not spending forever on stuff like this. Just know this episode is littered with it. The wider plot, no, that's a different story. There are two elements of this I'm going to look into in detail. A bit later I'm going to look at the stuff with a commentary on human spaceflight and how that relates to the astronaut characters and their roles in the story. First though, I'm just going to dive straight into the deep end and look at the crux of this episode. The moon is an egg. Just in case you missed that, the moon's an egg. Yes, the moon is an egg. Now, it's not that this is the massive thing that destroys continuity, although it is, most notably with the previous mentioned Doctor Who and the Silurians, which gives the moon being captured by the Earth's gravity being mistaken for a crash course as the reason for the Silurian hibernation. Now, I don't know much about the history of the moon, so how plausible that is in real life, I don't know, but I think it's safe to say it's a more reasonable explanation than the moon being an egg. No, it's not that at all. It's just that I'm somewhat bewildered sitting here, and that anyone, at any stage of this process, thought this would be a good idea. Who sat down and thought, you know what, let's make the moon an egg? I mean, what can I say about this? It's kind of beyond parody. It's really stupid, yeah, but in a very brain-melting sort of way, but what commentary can I put on this? The moon, the satellite of Earth, the one we see in the sky, and that all those American astronauts landed on 50 years ago, actually, it's an egg. Again, what am I supposed to say? I could try and come up with something more absurd, like, the Himalayas, they're actually a toast rack. Or Antarctica, that's what a big space giant uses to wipe his arse every 10,000 years. To be honest, that's only about equally as absurd. Here's a fun game. In the comments of this video, try and come up with an idea more absurd than the moon being an egg. I bet you'll struggle with it. Alright, I'm being a little facetious, and I'm sure this episode's defenders will try and point out that Doctor Who has had its fair share of absurd plots over the years, and we shouldn't be taking it so seriously. To which I have 4 answers. Firstly, the stories with the truly absurd plots were very rarely the good ones that were actually worth watching. Secondly, nothing the show ever did before could even hope to reach the level of insanity this plot is. Yeah, a bunch of dinosaurs on a spaceship is a dumb plot, but within a science fiction setting it has a level of plausibility to it. This is just batshit insane. Thirdly, thanks, but I am going to take Doctor Who seriously, because it's a show that has demonstrated on countless occasions it can have the drama and depth to go far beyond its premise and be worth taking seriously. If we're not going to take things seriously, then the whole show might as well just be fart jokes and flinging custard pies at each other. And finally, and this is the clincher, if we're not supposed to be taking this seriously, then maybe it wasn't such a good idea to put an extremely dark moral debate about life and death topics. I don't know, feel like that's maybe just a bit of a bad tonal mismatch. As for the finer points of the plot, well, I could be sitting here pointing out how it makes absolutely no sense in terms of biology and physics, but frankly, what's the point? I mean, if there was a story about a just space giant that wipes its arse with Antarctica, the last thing I'd be doing is pointing out that would be quite difficult to do with a large, icy landmass. I'd be wondering exactly what kind of shrooms the writer had consumed before putting pen to paper here, and that's exactly what I'm doing. I mean, honestly, the moon is an egg. The moon is an egg. Anyway, the other bit of the plot that demands my attention is sort of the background theme of the episode, for this attempts to at least be a sort of commentary on the idea of human spaceflight. Attempts being the word, but the basic idea is seeing this creature being born out of the moon, which doesn't get any less ridiculous to say, is what inspires humanity to go back into space after it had essentially been abandoned, apparently. Now, I will give this episode a tinsy-wincy, negligible amount of credit in this regard, as it's clear looking at the time since Doctor Who first appeared on our screens, that the endeavour of human spaceflight, the idea that there is so much for humanity to explore and learn beyond their own planet, has risen and fallen as a priority. And indeed, the situation in 2024, as much as it was in 2014 when this episode aired, promises of a future that appear to be too distant to really reach. I mean, in the last 10 years, what has really been achieved in the field of human spaceflight? The US launched some new commercial spacecraft, but that's about it really. The programme to return to the moon is going on, but the real achievement of getting back there feels very distant nonetheless. It does speak to a real regret of our times, that the pressing problems our society face here on Earth, they take priority, rightly or wrongly, over the exploration of the stars. The possibility of truly abandoning that future in space, it does feel very unlikely, but the idea that we will truly make progress in the exploration of the endless possibilities within our lifetimes, it feels remote. And that is a very interesting thing to explore, to think what would be the catalyst for us as a species to evaluate that and look to the stars and to look at our future. So I will give credit for this as an idea. But only as an idea, that because the episode mangles its execution of it so badly, it's just astonishing. First of all, and most obviously, the catalyst for this, I think it fairly unlikely it to be turning out that the moon is an egg and a giant space bat coming out of it. I don't know, just a hunch. So yeah, the defining moment of our species being so utterly ridiculous and impossible to take remotely seriously is not a great start. I'm not thinking when I see this, wow, what an incredibly inspiring moment. I'm thinking, what the fuck is that and what the fuck were these people thinking and making it? And also enraged out of my mind, but we'll get to that. It's great you built a solid foundation to build your house on, fantastic work. I won't begrudge you that for a second. But if you then go and build the house out of cheese, I'm unlikely to give any real credit all the same. This also leads to another issue, that it all comes together in about 2 sentences and is given no time to sink in. It hasn't been built up to a conclusion, it's just suddenly thrust at us through some dialogue by the Doctor. Oh, this is what it was about all the time, apparently. The biggest issue, though, is that this whole plotline underlines how little thought was truly being put into this script. Apparently humanity has abandoned spaceflight to the point where the only hope to stop the moon doing its thing is to send 3 middle-aged Brits in a space shuttle to sort that out. Now, first of all, I do have a very minor issue with that, in that that's not how the space shuttle works! In case you are aware, the space shuttle is built for getting into low Earth orbit and no further. Not because they didn't want to, but because the design of it completely precluded it. That's not what it was meant for. Rockets get beyond low Earth orbit through using different stages of the rocket for different parts of the flight. The Saturn V, the only rocket so far ever to propel humans beyond low Earth orbit, had a stage of the rocket used more or less specifically for the purpose of getting the command service module to the moon. The space shuttle, on the other hand, had a fixed launch setup: orbiter, tank, boosters. You couldn't add anything else onto it because of the design, and it was one specifically meant for low Earth orbit. That's it. Also, the shuttle famously glides back to Earth and lands on a runway, which does rather preclude landing on the moon, as you can't really glide in somewhere without an atmosphere, and the lack of a runway might be a bit of an issue. Now, you may think this isn't terribly relevant, to which I say, tough, I say it is and it's my show. I love the space shuttle, and I'm angry at how it's being used in such a cheap and lazy way, as if the writer couldn't even bother to Google before sitting down and writing this bit. But apparently there's no other way to make it work, because see, humanity has completely abandoned space travel. Totally, to the point where they had to take the shuttle out of a museum. Now, ignoring that the museum display may not be entirely space-worthy anymore, this implies a massive problem with this approach, and it's just so utterly unbelievable. Now, it's true, we're not making the progress in space that we could well be, but we're not abandoning it. There's still a constant presence in space with the International Space Station, the US and its partners are moving towards the moon again, and the Russians and the Chinese both have future plans of their own. Now, I get it feels like that for the audience of Doctor Who. We're British, a country with basically no involvement in the exploration of space, but it's just not remotely the case worldwide. And yet, by the year 2049, everyone will have completely abandoned any kind of human space travel at all, to the point where the only possible astronauts are 3 middle-aged people from a country with no spaceflight infrastructure at all, and the only spacecraft the museum exhibit. And yet, just 10 years earlier, there was a moon base established, something still just a distant ambition now, 10 years closer to the setting of this episode from when it was made, by Mexico, a country which in our present has very little involvement in human spaceflight. And obviously we get to see this through the Mexican stereotypes on display. I'm surprised there wasn't a sombrero with some tortilla chips there as well. So we advanced far enough that even countries without any real spaceflight infrastructure could build moon bases and train astronauts, then decided, nah, fuck it, and decommissioned everyone and everything. That sounds very plausible, doesn't it? See what I mean about no thought being put in? Ridiculous events have been stretched and warped to try and fit this idea. But that's not quite the end of it. We found out they brought along a bunch of nuclear bombs to blow up the moon? Now, I feel like if the issues you're having are that the warping of the moon is causing weather catastrophes on Earth, actually destroying it might not be the best idea. This is a genuinely huge issue with the story, in that we never find out what their original plan was. They just have the nuclear bombs so that they can conveniently destroy the creature inside the moon if it turns out to be an egg. I mean, they got very lucky, didn't they? That was quite a lot of foresight. It's a gaping hole you could drive a bus through, but again, it's all just lazily stretched and warped to fit the situation as it needs to be as the moral dilemma comes into play. It shows how little thought was put into this. I'll briefly talk about the supporting characters before I get to the 2 regulars and how said moral dilemma of the episode relates to them. Of the 3 astronauts, 2 of them are just lifeless cutouts there to die to prove the situation is serious, and Astronaut Lady is there just to be the straw man for the opposite argument to the one the writer thinks. I'll get to all that later, so that just leaves one person left. Courtney. Yeah, they decided to bring a schoolchild along. Now, I've seen a child actress criticised before, which I think is a bit unfair. Considering she's a child actress, I think she does fine. She certainly does better than some other child actors who've been on the show over time. The character itself, though, well, she's there for 2 purposes. 1, to be the source of some really bad comedy, and 2, to be the focus of some weird plot where Clara is angry at the Doctor for not calling Courtney special, and frankly my overall overriding thought whenever this was brought up was, who gives a shit? If it's meant to be the part of a wider theme of the Doctor and Clara's relationship and that of the Doctor with humanity in general, well, it doesn't work. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news with that one. She's mostly just in the way. Also, the resolution of the She Special plot is that she's apparently going to become President of America, despite being British, when the American presidency is famous for only being open to Americans. Yeah. Also, she's special because she becomes this hugely famous figure. Not because of her uniqueness and how she matters to people close to her or anything like that. No, you're only special if you make it big in the world. Christ. For reasons of brevity, I'm not going to spend too much on this though, because, well, we have bigger fish to fry. So, Clara Oswald. I think I will keep the wider discussion of her character for another time, mostly because I have a lot to say and related to this episode, and I've already done one big general discussion in this video and probably shouldn't do another, but there's a great deal about it that's relevant to this one. I'm not going to beat around the bush, I hate this character. I think she's an overbearing, egotistical, self-centered, controlling, and frankly morally bank-up twat, who's always quick with a speech about everyone else is wrong and she's in the right, but for some reason not so quick with actual solutions to problems or anything that might help. Her relationship with the 12th Doctor also really rubs me the wrong way. I never get the impression these are two people with a healthy relationship at all. I think she's just extremely dismissive and almost contemptuous of him. The way she just calls her his carer at one point just underlines the point, as if he can't do anything without her brilliance and that he's not at all capable without her to help him. What's worse is that the writing constantly fails to acknowledge and act upon her failings. I need only to point out to the finale of this series, when her unspeakably cruel and wretched behaviour towards the Doctor, in being perfectly willing to nearly destroy access to his home so she can get what he wants, is met with a shrug and an oh well. That she could be so selfish and yet have it treated as if she's in the right is what drives me nuts about this character. In terms of the episode, it starts with her essentially nagging the Doctor about the whole not telling Courtney she's special thing, which culminates in her essentially inviting Courtney and the TARDIS, despite the TARDIS being the Doctor's, not hers. It's a minor thing, but when Rose invited Adam along in Series 1, there was also that kind of presumptuous dick move on her part, but it was tempered by the fact that the Doctor was against it the whole time and is proven absolutely right. Here, well, taking Courtney as long as the Clara's will, so it's a great idea with absolutely no drawbacks. Hell, it even extends as she's bitching about it while they're crash landing in the space shuttle. Now, you would think someone would have priorities at that point. And yes, you're right, Clara's priority is always being right, even in a life or death situation. As much as I jest though, this is all pretty standard Clara stuff. The issue that I really have with this character in this episode is when we get to the moral dilemma. See, they found out the moon is an egg. No, that's never going to stop being ridiculous to say. Anyway, they found out the moon is an egg. Nope, still can't finish that. Okay. Anyway, they found out what they found out and have to decide what to do with the creature inside. If they kill it, the moon will probably be okay and Earth will be safe. If they don't, there's no telling what will happen. Now, I'll admit, there's a great deal of potential in this idea. It's a genuine moral dilemma, and, as I said earlier, there are no easy answers to it. The lives of the billions of people on Earth must come first, but it's never easy to commit cold-blooded murder, even if it's for the greater good. The problem is the execution. Once the Doctor has destroyed his character, left, Clara and Courtney are on one side, and Astronaut Lady on the other. C and C are absolutely adamant, without a moment's hesitation, that they cannot kill this thing, and Astronaut Lady's arguments are obviously intended to be a straw man against that. C&C's arguments are that they can't kill this thing, it would be murder. And Astronaut Lady's arguments are that however unique and wonderful this life form is, there are billions of people on Earth, and their lives may well be destroyed through inaction. The way they execute it was absolutely the wrong way to do it. What should be a genuine debate with no easy answers is being portrayed as having one very easy, obvious answer, and the other is just cold, heartless paranoia. How righteous Clara is about this, and that no other answer can simply be considered, it drives me insane. Astronaut Lady's obvious straw man arguments are in fact I think pretty reasonable, and the way Clara behaves makes me more inclined to agree with her. I don't think she's 100% right, I don't think the arguments Clara makes can be completely ignored, but no, killing a defenseless creature before the bloom of life begins is not a nice thing, it's a monstrous thing to do, but there are billions and billions of people on Earth. Billions of children, just as innocent, just as untouched, and just as important as this creature. If they are killed, and the moon erupting into this creature would, by most definitions, cause catastrophic disruption on Earth, and it's only through plot convenience that it doesn't, then how can you say you've prevented any murder and death? The only thing you've saved is your own conscience. Frankly, Clara's utter self-righteousness is absolutely loathsome. Yeah, I'm not saying you should like this, or that she'll be in there killing this thing without thinking about it at all, guns a-blazing. But she's just ignoring everything Astronaut Lady is saying, the real danger billions of people will be put in because she is convinced of her own righteousness. This is what I hate about this character, that even in the situation of genuinely heart-crushing dilemma, one in which there is no decision that would leave someone without a guilty conscience they would carry forever, she's just absolutely convinced that she's right, and the script clearly thinks she is too. These scenes are painful, and they're not helped by the usual Moffat-era tone problems.
Oh, you want to talk about babies? You've probably got babies down there, no? You want to have babies?
What?
Yeah.
Mr. Pink.
Shh.
Yeah, great idea. In the middle of your tense moral dilemma in which the fate of the entire world is at stake, let's put in a terrible joke about Clara's war criminal boyfriend. Jesus fucking Christ. Also, children don't act like that. In situations that are serious and tense, and Courtney has shown to understand and be invested in that situation, she would be no more likely to make jokes than the others. Honestly, how much lower can you sink? Well, we're going to find out. So, Clara isn't able to defeat Astronaut Lady in a game of words, so she decides to palm off the decision to a democratic vote. Never mind the extremely pressing nature of this, in that any delay could be crucial, we have to do it this way so Clara can have the world endorse the decision she's already made in her head. So, after just believing this random woman on the radio that the moon is an egg, the world votes, by turning off its lights or keeping them on. So, either this vote takes place across a 24-hour period, which, let's face it, looks pretty unlikely, or only about half the world actually got to vote. Screw you, Asia and Australia. Europe and Africa are deciding the fate of the world for you. Yeah, the logistics of this vote doesn't really make any sense, but never mind. We have much more pressing issues to look at than the entire premise of this part of the episode not making the tiniest lick of sense. So, it turns out that the people of the world vote for their own survival over some creature and a moon egg. I know, shocking. Clara, irritated her plan didn't work, at first looks like she's acquiescing, but then deactivates the bomb anyway. Honestly, how can someone be so utterly convinced of their own righteousness that you would hold a vote for the entire world, lose, and then do what you originally wanted to do anyway? I hear maybe you're saying, well, the wider population will only make a decision for their own interest and not consider the wider ramifications. To which I say, yeah, welcome to democracy. I don't think the alternative of one person choosing what they think is right is any better at all. And in any case, if Clara did think that, she shouldn't have held the vote in an effort to get the answer she wanted anyway. This is why I hate this character. The entire world tells her one thing, she decides the answer is actually something else, and the script makes it out like she's being perfectly right in the face of that. It's maddening. As for the rest of her character in this episode, well, that plays into the final thing I'm going to talk about. Up until this point, this episode has been cruising at a solid 1 out of 10. It's awful, and I shouldn't need to repeat why. But there hasn't really been anything that makes me think this is worse than, for instance, paving slab blowjobs. This final point, this is what drops it into last spot. This is what makes it the worst episode of NuWho. In Time Heist the other month, I talked about how the character of the 12th Doctor didn't work right in Series 8. The arc didn't come across like it should have done. Instead of feeling dark and calculating, he just came across like an arsehole who didn't give a shit. His constant lack of feeling towards the deaths of others and being so dismissive of their concerns, and the way this characterization just felt so lacking in depth, meant that he just became solidly unlikable, despite the efforts of Peter Capaldi, whose performance was always magnificent. And he's good in this episode as well, despite what he has to perform. The culmination of all this in this episode, even throughout the early and mid parts of the episode, he's acting like a dick. For instance, when one of the guy astronauts gets attacked by the spiders and killed, he basically does nothing to help him at all, he just tells them all to run away. And yet when Courtney is in trouble, he pulls out all the stops to help her. It comes across like he's only willing to save people he's spoken to before, or even worse, he's only willing to save people that would get his companion annoyed if they died. He doesn't come across as dispassionate and calculating, he looks like he doesn't give a rat's arse about someone's death. But in any case, that's not quite a real issue here. Once the moon being an egg is revealed, no, still can't quite manage that. Once the big reveal is revealed, the Doctor decides that because of some convoluted bullshit he was going on about earlier, he can't see the outcome of this, so a decision needs to be made. A decision he has decided humanity needs to make on its own. So, he leaves. He leaves behind Clara, Courtney, Astronaut Lady, and the entire human race. He does not return until the decision has been made. This is unforgivable. The moon can be an egg, Clara can be an insufferable twat, all of that I can just accept as awful Doctor Who and move on from. This, no, I can't. You might disagree, you might say this is an interesting interpretation and a worthwhile character beat, but I will respectfully, strongly disagree as much as I can. To me, the Doctor never, ever, ever walks away. Ever. That is not who he is. That is not who he ever, in any regeneration, will ever be. The Doctor does all of this, does so through all those lives, all those years, to save people and protect people and defeat those who would threaten them. At the end of the second Doctor's life, he boldly stood up before his people on trial for the crime of doing exactly this, and told them, without a hint of regret or hesitation, that while they have just been observing the suffering in the universe, he cannot abide by it.
You have heard the charge against you, that you have repeatedly broken our most important law of non-interference in the affairs of other planets. What have you to say? Do you admit these actions?
I not only admit them, I am proud of them. While you have been content merely to observe the evil in the galaxy, I have been fighting against it.
It is not we who are on trial here, Doctor. It is you.
No, of course you're above criticism, aren't you?
Do you admit that these actions were justified?
Yes, of course I do.
That is who the Doctor is. He accepted an effective death sentence and an exile for his next regeneration in defence of this. He put himself on the line time and time again, sacrificed so much in order to defeat the monsters of the universe and to save the innocent. He gave his life for this, at Legopolis, on Androzani, on the game station. The Doctor places innocent life and its preservation above anything. That's who he is. That is why he does what he does. The idea that he would walk away from a situation like this, where there are billions of lives that could be destroyed, where one wrong decision could affect the future of so many, or deny them that future at all, it's frankly offensive to me as a fan of this series. The Doctor is not Captain Picard. He does not have a prime directive to follow. He is not interested in preserving some natural order of things or some non-interference directive. He interferes. That is what he does. He's walking away for a reason completely invented by the writer of this episode, but goes against what this character is and stands for. Even the Sixth Doctor, at his most pig-headedly arrogant, or the Seventh Doctor, at his most callously calculating, would need fucking lobotomies to be this casually cruel and uncaring. He's essentially walking away from the potential deaths of billions of people because he thinks it will build fucking character. Now, you might be saying, but we're meant to think he's in the wrong. To which I say, yeah, no fucking shit. I would hope that walking away from a potentially species-destroying catastrophe is not being portrayed as the right choice. He's doing this because we're supposed to side with Clara instead of him. And because of what an utter moral vacuum she is, the only way that's possible is if he does something so utterly callous that we have no choice but to side with her. So, congratulations. All it took was character assassination on the grandest scale. And yet somehow, still doesn't work. The confrontation between the two of them afterwards is just astonishing, frankly. You seriously get the feeling from Clara that she's not angry that he left the human race in a situation where it could be nearly destroyed. You get the feeling she's angry because he left the decision with her. It's all about you, isn't it? And yet, the Doctor cannot defend his position, because it is indefensible. Now, I hope the venom I've been spewing has conveyed my outrage at this. Doctor Who, for me, and hopefully for others, is a symbol of the good that one person can do. The Doctor will fight for the innocent, for the oppressed, for the victims, for anyone just living their lives as ordinarily or as strangely as they like, against those who would kill, dominate, or oppress them. He is a symbol of hope in a way, and his relationship with humanity, i.e. the species that actually watches him out of universe, is one of hope as well. That we are good enough, that we have made enough promise that someone like the Doctor would consider us worth all those sacrifices. He doesn't need to leave us because it's the decision we need to make ourselves. The Doctor already knows we're capable of making the right decision, and capable of making the wrong one as well. But he's not here to morally judge, or at least not here to put any moral judgments above the task he has in protecting us. In his third incarnation, while in exile on Earth, he frequently saw the best of worst in humanity in just one man, the Brigadier, and he frequently poured scorn and judgment on the Brigadier. But do you think for a moment he would have left the Brigadier, or Joe, or Liz, or anyone else from that era, with the fate of humanity in their hands, the fate of billions in their hands, and decide not to do all he could to save them? Despite all his scorn and judgments, he never would for a moment. Now, the Doctor is a flawed character. He can sometimes be selfish, he can be tempted, he can allow his feelings to temper his judgment, and indeed he can be just as liable to become clouded by his own conscience and morals as Clara was here. But what he would never do is just give up and let someone else make the decision. Common across every incarnation, every version of the Doctor, is that they take the decisions they think necessary to save the lives of those they think they need to be saved, and it's owned every time, except this one. So, as far as something as trivial as a TV show like Doctor Who can outrage me, this outrages me. So, I hope I've explained why this is the bottom of the list for me. I can take appallingly presented politics, terrible dialogue, logic holes, and Clara being Clara. I cannot take the fundamental basis of the Doctor's character being destroyed for the cheap act of trying to improve the moral standing of another character. This is what causes an already terrible episode to drop to the bottom. And what of Hamlet? Well, I said at the beginning, the famous soliloquy has become the most famous in the English language, as one man pondering his own life and his own death. In Kill the Moon, we ponder the fate of billions, and yet the fate of one. To be or not to be. The whole point of that question is that it's unanswerable. We do not truly know what death entails, what on the other side of that door, what to not to be means. Kill the Moon attempts to answer the question, and yet it doesn't. It tries to give life to one, but cannot ponder the lives of those it might snuff out as a result. For one to be, others must not be. This episode takes the great challenge set out by Shakespeare 400 years ago, and fails. Again, I'm not expecting Doctor Who to meet that standard. This isn't necessarily even a criticism, it's just an observation of what this episode tries to think and tries to say, and what it ends up thinking and saying as a result. Final score for Kill the Moon is 0 out of 10. This is the worst episode of NuWho, no doubt. The story is so stupid it still feels beyond belief even saying it out loud. The moon is an egg. The politics ill thought out and ham-fisted, the character work appalling, and it does, well, I think I've made clear what I found unforgivable at this point, so I shall not repeat myself. Just a truly, truly awful episode. There will be bad Doctor Who on the horizon as long as there is Doctor Who being made. That's been a truth since the show began, and as with any TV series, not everything you make can be good. That's understandable. But I don't think anything will ever surpass this. The callous cruelty of the main character seeing so many people potentially die and walking away. So yeah, this is my pick for the worst. Well, have a good April Fool's Day, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm still open to any requests if you have any stories you want to see reviewed, so drop in the comments if you have any. And thanks again for watching.